The engine was off, but my hands were still on the steering wheel. I don't know how long I sat there, 2 minutes, maybe 5, just staring at the house through the windshield. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with peace. Every lawn was trimmed to the same obsessive length. Every porch light glowed at the same calculated warmth. Every house on that street looked like it had been built not to be lived in, but to be looked at. Nothing had changed. That was the most unsettling part. 6 years ago, I left this exact driveway in tears, wearing garden overalls and driving a 12-year-old Honda that rattled at anything above 50 miles per hour. I had my hands on that wheel too, but they were shaking then. Tonight, they were steady. Tonight, I was sitting in a charcoal gray electric SUV that cost more than Julian's first 3 years of college tuition. Tonight, I was wearing a tailored suit and my late husband's pearls. And on the passenger seat beside me, there was a manila envelope that I had picked up from my lawyer's office just 2 hours before. I did not open the envelope in the car. I already knew every word inside it. I had read it so many times the corners of the pages had gone soft. I just let it sit there. I looked at the front door of their house, white, freshly painted, flanked by 2 potted topiaries that probably cost more than most people's grocery bills. The lights were on inside. I could see the faint movement of a silhouette through the frosted glass panel. Someone was watching for me. Of course they were. I thought about the last time I had stood at that door. The way it had closed behind me. The sound it made, not a slam, nothing so honest as a slam, just a soft, definitive click. The kind of sound a lock makes when someone decides they are finished with you. And now they had turned the lights on and set the table and sent a text full of warm words like family and growth, and we miss you. 6 years of silence, and all it took was a magazine cover. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror once, not out of vanity, out of necessity. I needed to see the woman who was about to walk through that door. I needed to make sure she was still there. She was. Has someone ever made you feel so small that you started building, just to prove them wrong? Because what I did in those 6 years, and what happened at that dinner table, I need you to hear all of it. People who saw this coming subscribed. Don't be the last to know. And if you're not ready to subscribe yet, drop a comment right now. Tell me what's holding you back. I genuinely want to know. My name is Beatrice Sterling. I am 71 years old, and I have lived in the same small Connecticut town for most of my adult life. The kind of town where people still wave from their porches, and the post office knows your name without looking at the envelope. For 27 years, I was the head librarian at the Millbrook Public Library. I wore denim overalls on weekdays and church clothes on Sundays, and I made no apologies for either. I grew tomatoes in my backyard every summer, big, ugly, irregular ones that tasted the way store-bought tomatoes only pretend to. I baked from scratch on Saturday mornings because I had the time, and because the smell of something real rising in the oven is one of the few things in this world that asks nothing of you in return. I was not a glamorous woman. I was not the kind of mother you'd see on a lifestyle blog, arranging charcuterie boards for a camera. I was the kind of mother who showed up, every single time, in every way that actually counted. My husband, Robert, passed away when Julian was 4 years old. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the way that particular disease tends to be. One season he was here, the next he wasn't. I was 34 years old, alone in a house with a mortgage, a toddler, and a librarian's salary that was never meant to stretch as far as I had to make it stretch. But I did not move back to my mother's house. I did not ask for help I hadn't earned. I picked Julian up. I kept going, and I did not put him down for the next 18 years. I tucked that boy in every night until he was old enough to be embarrassed about it, and then I knocked on his door and said goodnight through the wood, because embarrassed was fine, but alone was not something I was willing to let him feel. I sat at the kitchen table with him through long division and the American Revolution and every science project that nearly broke both of us. When he got into his first choice college on a partial scholarship, I cried in the parking lot of the library on my lunch break where no one could see me. And then I went back inside and helped 3 second graders find books about dinosaurs. because the bills did not pause for joy any more than they paused for grief. I am telling you this not for sympathy. I am telling you this because you need to understand who I was before any of what comes next, so that when I tell you what happened, you feel the full weight of it. Julian, as a boy, was everything. Curious, kind, funny in that dry, quiet way that snuck up on you. He used to follow me around the garden asking the names of every plant as though he were memorizing a foreign language. He had Robert's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looked almost amber in the afternoon light. He was a good kid. I want to be clear about that. He was a genuinely good kid. The shift was gradual. The way most significant changes are not a single dramatic moment, but a slow, almost imperceptible turning, like a house settling on its foundation. It began when he met Sloane at 32. She was polished in the way that takes considerable effort and money to maintain. Beautiful, yes. Ambitious, absolutely. And from the very first dinner when she looked at my garden overalls and said, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, "Oh, how charming you're so." Rustic. I understood that in Sloane's world, I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. Julian laughed at that dinner. Not unkindly, but he laughed. I told myself it didn't matter. That love weathers things. That my son knew who I was, even if his new life didn't have a category for me. Have you ever loved someone so completely that you forgot to ask whether they were loving you back the same way? I forgot to ask for a long time. It was a Saturday in late April, the kind of day that Connecticut does better than anywhere else on Earth, warm without being aggressive, the sky so blue it almost looked painted. Leo was turning 3 years old, and Sloane had arranged the birthday party the way she arranged everything in her life, with architectural precision and an audience in mind. The party was held on their back patio. There were linen tablecloths and a balloon installation that I later found out cost $400. The guest list was a careful curation of Julian's professional contacts and Sloane's inner circle, women who arrived in sunglasses and spoke in the clipped, confident tones of people who had never once worried about a grocery bill. There were perhaps 20 adults and a handful of children who all seemed to have been coached on how to behave at parties. And there was the food. Lord, there was the food. Sloane had hired a caterer who specialized in what she called clean celebration cuisine. There were quinoa bites and fruit skewers arranged like architecture, and a kale salad with a lemon tahini dressing that 3 different guests complimented loudly enough for Sloane to hear. On the refrigerator inside, I had seen it when I went to wash my hands. She had taped what she called Leo's nutritional roadmap, a laminated sheet. For a 3-year-old's birthday party. I had brought fudge. My grandmother's recipe, the one she made every Christmas in a cast iron pot on a wood-burning stove, the one I had made every holiday season for 40 years, the one Julian used to eat standing over the kitchen counter before it had even finished cooling. Dark chocolate, a touch of vanilla, a pinch of sea salt. Simple, perfect. The kind of thing that tastes like someone loves you. I had cut it into small squares and wrapped them in wax paper, tied with kitchen twine, because that is how my grandmother gave it, and that is how I had always given it. I waited until the formal part of the party was winding down. The cake had already been served, the candles blown out, the photographs taken. Leo was sitting on the patio steps, still wearing his little paper birthday crown, and he looked up at me with those amber eyes that were so much his father's that my chest ached every time I saw them. I crouched down beside him and held out a square of fudge. "This is great-great-grandmommy's recipe," I told him quietly. "She made it for everyone she loved." He took it with both hands the way small children take things, completely. With total trust, and he smiled. That smile. I want you to hold that image because it is the last peaceful moment of this story for a very long time. Sloane saw it from across the patio. She didn't walk over. She crossed. There is a difference. One is movement. The other is intention. Her face had shifted into something I had never seen on it before, a kind of controlled fury that was all the more frightening for how quietly it operated. She plucked the fudge from Leo's hands without a word to him, set it on the table as though it were contaminated, and turned to me. Her voice, when she used it, was low and precise. "Beatrice, we have a nutritional framework for Leo. I've explained this. We don't introduce unvetted sugar to his diet without discussion. I said as calmly as I could manage. It's a piece of fudge, Sloan. It's his birthday. That was apparently the wrong answer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She turned toward Julian, who had appeared at the patio door, reading the room the way a man reads a room when he already knows it has gone wrong, and she let her eyes fill with tears that arrived with suspicious efficiency. Then she said, just loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear every syllable, I told you she doesn't respect our boundaries. She's toxic, Julian. It's him or her. She didn't just speak those words. She performed them. Every pause, every catch in her throat, every fractional glance at the surrounding guests. It was calculated. A woman who had spent years curating her image knew exactly how to curate a moment of crisis. And Julian. My son, the boy I had raised alone on a librarian's salary. The boy I had sat with through fevers and failures and every ordinary Tuesday that makes up a life. He looked at me for exactly 1 second, and then his eyes went to his shoes. His very expensive Italian leather shoes. And he said, in a voice so quiet it was almost gentle, maybe it's best if you head home, Mom. We need some space. A lot of it. I did not cry. Not on that patio, not with those people watching. I picked up my handbag. I said goodbye to no one. I walked through the house and out the front door, and I sat in my car in their driveway, and I drove myself home. I sat in my own driveway for 22 minutes before I went inside. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard move, and I needed something to look at that wasn't my own reflection. That was the last time I saw my grandson's face for 6 years. But it was not the last time I heard about their lives. Now some people, when I tell this story, say I should have apologized, that I should have respected the boundaries, however extreme, that keeping the peace was worth more than a piece of fudge. I want to know what you think. Drop it in the comments right now. Was I wrong? Guilty or not guilty? Because what happened next is going to depend entirely on how you answer that question. A lot of space turned out to mean everything. The first card I sent was a simple one, a thinking of you card from the drugstore, nothing elaborate. I wrote 3 sentences inside it. I told Julian I loved him. I told him I missed Leo. I told him my door was open whenever he was ready. I mailed it on a Tuesday morning on my way to work, and I spent the rest of that day telling myself it was a beginning, not an ending. It came back to me 11 days later. Return to sender. No note. Just my own handwriting looking up at me from the mailbox like an accusation. I sent 2 more cards after that, one at Thanksgiving, one at Christmas. Both came back. By January, my calls were going directly to voicemail. By February, the number had been blocked entirely. I was not gradually phased out. I was removed. Cleanly, deliberately, the way you remove an item from a list. Sloane's blog, Life of Elegance, was still public, and for a period of time I'm not proud of, I read it. She posted 3 times a week. White marble countertops, gallery wall arrangements, carefully lit photographs of Leo in linen outfits, always clean, always posed, always holding something, a book, a wooden toy, a piece of fruit, that telegraphed the life they wanted people to believe they were living. He grew in those photographs in the way children grow when you are only watching from a distance. A tooth here, an inch there, a new word you will never hear him say out loud. I watched my grandson grow up on a lifestyle blog. The phantom ache is the only way I know to describe what those first 2 years felt like, a pain in a place that had nothing to do with the body. I would sit on my porch on Sunday afternoons and watch the neighbors' grandchildren play in the yard across the street, and I would feel my arms go heavy with the specific weight of someone they were not holding. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and persistent, the way real grief almost always is. The first Christmas alone was the hardest single day. I cooked a full meal out of stubbornness, roast chicken, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce from scratch, and I sat at my kitchen table and ate it by myself with the radio on because silence felt like surrender. I kept the table set for 3 out of habit. I cleared the extra plates before I let myself cry. Leo's 4th birthday came and went. I knew about it from a blog post. Sloane had written about the party's color theme, sage green and gold, and included 17 photographs of a boy who was half mine by blood and 0% mine by access. He was wearing a tiny button-down shirt and laughing at something off camera. I closed the laptop and did not open it again for 6 weeks. Grief, I have learned, does have a shelf life. It does not disappear, I want to be honest about that. But at a certain point, it stops being the loudest thing in the room. For me, that point came on a Tuesday in March, somewhere in the middle of the 3rd year of silence. I was sitting on my porch and I looked out at my backyard, 3 acres of soil I had largely ignored since Robert died, overgrown and wild and full of unrealized possibility, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a thunderclap or a revelation, just a quiet internal turning, the way a key feels when it finally finds the right lock. I went inside, put on my overalls, found my old gardening gloves in the hall closet, and went out to pick up a shovel. I was done grieving a family that had chosen to be a rumor in my life. If they wanted me silent, I would be silent. But I was going to make that silence the loudest, most consequential thing they had ever asked for. If I was going to be dead to them, I decided to make my afterlife spectacular. Have you ever been discarded by someone you gave everything to? Just set aside like you never mattered. We don't miss the comeback. Subscribe, the next part changes everything. Still on the fence about subscribing? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know why. Because what Beatrice built from that backyard and that shovel is something nobody saw coming. And you do not want to hear about it secondhand. The first morning I went out to that backyard with a shovel, I almost turned around and went back inside. 3 acres sounds romantic until you are standing in the middle of it at 7 in the morning with work gloves that have gone stiff from disuse, looking at soil that has not been properly tended in years. The ground was compacted in places, waterlogged in others. There were weeds that had grown so confident in their occupation that they had started to look permanent. The old raised beds Robert had built the summer before he got sick were still there, good bones, rotten wood. Everything needed work. Real work, the kind that does not care how you feel about it. I started anyway. I did what I have always done when something felt too large to hold all at once. I broke it into pieces small enough to carry. The first week I cleared, just cleared. I pulled weeds until my shoulders ached and my knees reminded me that I was not, in fact, 35 years old. The second week, I rebuilt the raised beds using lumber I bought myself, cut myself, and installed myself, with a YouTube tutorial playing on my phone propped against a flower pot. The third week, I planted. I had always grown tomatoes and basic herbs, basil, rosemary, thyme, the ordinary things. But somewhere in that first month of digging, a thought took hold that I could not shake loose. What if ordinary was exactly what I was done being? I drove to the library, my library, the one where I had worked for 27 years, where every shelf was as familiar to me as the lines of my own hands. And I spent 3 days reading everything I could find about horticulture, botanical chemistry, and the market for rare medicinal plants. I was a librarian. Research was not a skill I had to acquire. It was the architecture of how I thought. I began crossbreeding heirloom roses, working toward colors and scent profiles that no commercial grower was producing at scale. I started cultivating medicinal herbs that high-end wellness brands and apothecaries paid significant premiums for: tulsi, ashwagandha, lemon verbena, valerian. I learned the chemistry of soil enrichment the same way I had learned everything else in my life, slowly, carefully, and with the absolute intention of mastering it. The backyard stopped looking like neglect. It started looking like intention. The first sale happened 14 months in, and it arrived the way most real things do, without fanfare. A chef named Marcus Webb, who ran a farm-to-table restaurant in downtown Hartford, had heard about my microgreens through a mutual acquaintance at the farmer's market, where I had started selling on weekends. He drove out on a Wednesday afternoon, walked through my raised beds without saying very much, picked up a handful of pea shoots, smelled them, tasted one, and said, "How much for a standing weekly order?" I named a price I thought was reasonable. He didn't blink. He wrote me a check on the spot. I stood in my backyard after his car pulled away and looked at that check for a long time. It wasn't a large amount of money. It wasn't life-changing in any financial sense. But it was the first time since Robert died that someone had looked at something I had built entirely alone and decided it was worth paying for. I folded it carefully and put it in my shirt pocket and went back to work. That check is framed on the wall of my office today. By the second year, I had more orders than I could fill alone. That was when I hired my first employee, a 24-year-old horticulture graduate named Devin, who showed up to the interview in mud-stained boots and knew more about mycorrhizal networks than anyone I had ever met. Devin called me Ms. Sterling for exactly 1 week before I told her to stop. After that, she called me Boss B, and within a month, everyone on the team did. The team grew. 3 people, then 6, then 11. Young, sharp, genuinely passionate about the work in a way that reminded me of myself at the library, that particular energy of someone who has found the thing they were built for. They brought ideas I would not have thought of. I brought decades of discipline they had not yet developed. We built something together that neither of us could have built alone. I registered Sterling Botanicals as a formal business entity on a Thursday afternoon in November. I drove to the county clerk's office with my application and my filing fee, and I handed over my documents to a clerk who stamped them with the particular efficiency of someone who processes paperwork all day and has no idea which pieces of it will one day matter. I walked out with my business license and sat in the parking lot and thought about the library card I had carried in my wallet for 27 years. Same wallet, different card, same woman, but not somehow the same life. The Hamptons came next, and it came faster than I had planned. A landscape architect named Patrick Doyle had seen Devin's photographs of our greenhouse on a trade association website and reached out about designing the grounds of 3 adjacent luxury estates in Southampton. The commission was larger than my entire first year of revenue. I said yes before I finished reading the email. Word moved the way it does in wealthy circles, quietly, but with velocity. By the end of that year, Sterling Botanicals had consulting contracts with 9 luxury properties, a wholesale arrangement with 4 high-end hotel groups, and a line of soil enrichment serums that 2 Manhattan boutiques were selling at prices that would have seemed absurd to me 5 years earlier. I named the brand identity, legacy and roots. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Legacy and roots, built by a woman whose own roots had been deliberately cut, by a son who had decided her legacy was an embarrassment to his brand. I did not choose that name out of bitterness. I chose it because it was true. Because everything I was building was about what you leave behind, and what holds you up, and what grows back when someone tears the ground out from under you. The public loved it. They loved the story of the grandmother who turned 3 neglected acres into a green empire. They called me the grandma of the Green Revolution in a regional trade magazine, and I laughed so hard at that headline that Devin came running to check if I was all right. But nothing, not the Hamptons contracts, not the boutique partnerships, not the trade magazine feature. Nothing prepared me for the morning my assistant forwarded an email from the editorial director of Vanguard Living. I almost deleted it. I thought it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. For those who don't move in certain circles, the name Vanguard Living may not mean much. But in the world that Sloan had spent the better part of a decade trying to inhabit, the world of charity galas and designer kitchens, and carefully curated social media feeds, Vanguard Living was not just a magazine. It was a credential. It was the publication she left on her coffee table, not because she read it, but because she needed guests to see that it was there. It was the arbiter of who mattered, and who was simply trying to. And they wanted me for the cover. Not a feature mention, not a sidebar, the cover, of the Visionaries of the New Decade issue. I remember reading the email 3 times before I called my assistant back in. "Read this," I said, and slid my laptop across the desk. She read it, looked up at me, and said with complete seriousness, "Boss B, if you don't say yes, I will say yes for you." I said yes. The photo shoot took 3 days and was held entirely inside the greenhouse I had built on the far end of the property. The one Devin and I had designed together, all glass panels and reclaimed wood framing, the interior so dense with green that stepping inside felt like stepping into a different atmosphere entirely. The Vanguard team arrived with 17 equipment cases, and a creative director named Sylvia who walked through the greenhouse without speaking for 4 full minutes before turning to me and saying, "This place has a soul. We are not changing a single thing." They put me in a silk emerald green tunic, the exact shade of the foliage surrounding me. They did my hair simply back clean, the way I wore it every day. No theatrical makeup, no borrowed jewelry. Just my late husband's pearls, which I had brought without being asked, and which Sylvia looked at and said, "Perfect. Leave them exactly as they are." I stood in the center of my greenhouse, surrounded by everything I had grown from nothing, and I let them take the photographs. I will tell you something I have never told anyone. On the second day of that shoot, between setups, I stood alone in the far corner of the greenhouse where no one could see me clearly, and I pressed my hand flat against the glass panel and looked out at the 3 acres that had once been overgrown and abandoned. And I thought about a woman sitting in her car in her own driveway for 22 minutes because she didn't know how to go inside an empty house. I was not that woman anymore. When the issue hit stands in early spring, my face was everywhere. Airport newsstands, grocery store checkout lines, the waiting rooms of the kind of medical specialists and private wealth managers whose clients did not look at price tags. The headline read, "Beatrice Sterling, the horticulture queen building a green empire." I bought 3 copies from the drugstore near my house, the same drugstore where I used to buy the thinking of you cards that came back marked return to sender. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea and looked at my own face on that glossy cover for a long time. I had not done this for revenge. I want to be clear about that. I had done it because the alternative, withering quietly in a house full of silence, was something I had simply refused to accept. But sitting at that table, in that quiet kitchen, I knew with absolute certainty that the world Sloane had tried so hard to belong to had just put my face on its front door. Vultures can smell success from miles away. My phone was on the table beside my tea. I had never changed the ringtone assigned to Julian's contact, a specific tone I'd set years ago, back when I still believed he might one day use it to tell me he missed me. The screen lit up. It wasn't a call. It was a text. And it wasn't from Julian. You don't want to miss what that text said. Subscribe now, before this story goes somewhere you won't see coming. Not ready to subscribe yet? Drop a comment below what's stopping you, because I promise you what she wrote in that message is not what anyone expected. I picked up the phone and read it slowly. Not because the words were complicated, because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what I was looking at. This is what Sloane wrote. "B, we just saw the Vanguard living feature. Absolutely stunning. We are so incredibly proud of everything you've achieved. Julian hasn't stopped talking about how much he misses his mom. We've been through a lot of growth lately and realize life is too short for old misunderstandings. Family dinner tonight at 7. We'd love for you to see how much Leo has grown. Please say yes." I set the phone face down on the table. Then I picked it up and read it again. B, she had never called me B. In 6 years of occasional, performative cordiality before the exile, it had always been Beatrice, delivered with the faint emphasis of someone who finds the name slightly too common for their taste. B was warm. B was familiar. B was the opening move of a woman who needed something. We are so incredibly proud. Not Julian. Not I, we. As though the two of them had sat together, watching my success unfold, swelling with a shared pride that had somehow survived 6 years of blocked phone numbers and returned mail. The pride of people who had done nothing to contribute to the outcome and everything to complicate the journey. A lot of growth. I read that phrase 3 times. Growth. The language of therapy and self-help podcasts deployed here as a shield. A way of suggesting transformation without specifying what exactly had transformed, or who had done the transforming, or why it had taken a magazine cover to trigger it. And then, old misunderstandings. I almost laughed. I genuinely almost laughed out loud in my own kitchen. 6 years. 6 years of blocked calls and returned cards and watching my grandson grow up in staged photographs on a lifestyle blog. 6 years of Christmas mornings alone and birthdays I knew about only because Sloane had documented them for public consumption. 6 years of being treated as though I had never existed, and she had condensed all of it into 2 words: old misunderstandings, as though what had happened between us was a minor clerical error, a scheduling conflict, a slight difference of opinion about the seating chart. I put the phone down again and opened my laptop. It took me less than 20 minutes to find what I was looking for. Julian's architectural firm, the high-end residential practice he had built over the past decade, the one that had served as the financial engine of their particular brand of elegance, had filed 2 significant loss disclosures in the past 18 months. A luxury condominium development in Fairfield County had collapsed after the primary investor pulled out. A second project, a boutique hotel conversion in Providence, had stalled indefinitely after construction cost overruns that the firm had apparently guaranteed to absorb. The business journals were not unkind, but they were specific. The firm was in serious trouble. I closed the laptop. They were not reaching out because Julian missed his mother. They were not reaching out because Sloane had undergone a sincere reckoning with her behavior. They were reaching out because the financial architecture of their carefully constructed life was showing cracks that their own resources could no longer fill, and my face had just appeared on the cover of the most visible publication in their social universe. They weren't looking for a mother. They were looking for a life raft, and I was currently the largest ship in the harbor. I sat with that knowledge for 4 hours. I did not reply immediately, not out of pettiness, but out of principle. A woman who had waited 6 years could afford to wait 4 hours. I wanted them to look at that delivered message and wonder. I wanted the silence to have weight. At 6:17 in the evening, I picked up my phone and typed 9 words. 7:00 p.m. works. See you then. I pressed send, then I went upstairs to get dressed. I did not put on garden overalls. I did not reach for the comfortable cardigan I wore on winter evenings. I opened the back of my closet and took out the charcoal gray suit I had bought the previous fall for a business conference in Boston. Tailored, precise, the kind of garment that communicates authority before a single word is spoken. I put on Robert's pearls. I checked my reflection with the same quiet deliberateness I bring to everything that matters. Then I drove to my lawyer's office, where a manila envelope had been waiting in a locked drawer for the better part of 3 months. I had asked my attorney to prepare it quietly, without urgency, just in case this day ever arrived. I picked it up. I placed it on the passenger seat, and I drove toward the white houses and the manicured lawns with the calm of a woman who was not going to dinner. I was going to close a deal. Now I have to ask you something directly, and I want you to be honest with me in the comments. Was she right to go? Knowing everything she knew, knowing exactly why that text had been sent, would you have walked back through that door? Comment Boss B right now if you would have done exactly the same thing. And if you would have handled it differently, tell me that too. Because what happened at that table is something I still think about. The drive took 40 minutes, and I used every one of them. Not to rehearse what I would say, I already knew what I was going to do, and people who know what they are going to do not need to rehearse. I used the drive to observe, to let the familiar landscape of their neighborhood move past my windshield like something I was watching rather than entering. The exit off the highway. The turn onto the tree-lined road that announced, in the particular language of old New England money, that you were now somewhere that considered itself significant. The houses growing larger and more deliberate as I drove deeper in. Each one set back from the road at a distance that communicated privacy. Each lawn maintained at a level of perfection that suggested the people inside had long ago outsourced any relationship with actual soil. It felt exactly the same as it had 6 years ago. That was the thing about neighborhoods like this. They were engineered to feel timeless. Nothing aged visibly. Nothing was allowed to be imperfect long enough to become interesting. It was the physical embodiment of the life Sloane had always wanted. Controlled, curated, and completely resistant to anything real. I turned into their driveway and parked. I want you to understand what that driveway saw when I stepped out of my vehicle. Not the woman in garden overalls who had left it in tears 6 years ago. Not the librarian with the rattling Honda and the return-to-sender cards. It saw a woman in a charcoal gray tailored suit stepping out of a high-end electric SUV, pearls at her throat, a designer handbag on her arm, and an expression of absolute composure on her face. The SUV alone cost more than Julian's first 3 years of college tuition, and I had paid for it in cash. I did not hurry toward the door. I took my time. Sloane was already there when I reached the front steps. The door had opened before I knocked, which told me she had been watching from the window. She was wearing a cream-colored wrap dress and a smile so fixed and so wide that it had clearly been assembled rather than felt. She extended both arms toward me in the universal gesture of a warm embrace. I stepped past her into the foyer. Not aggressively, not with any visible hostility. I simply moved through the doorway as though the outstretched arms were a revolving door rather than an invitation, pausing just long enough to say, "Sloane," in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and completely empty of everything she was hopping to find in it. She recovered quickly, I'll give her that. The arms came down, the smile held, and she followed me inside with a bright, practiced, "You look expensive, B," delivered in the tone of a compliment that was also, somehow, a question. I didn't answer it. Julian was in the living room. He was standing near the fireplace with a glass of scotch that looked like it had been poured some time ago and not much enjoyed since. He looked older than I had expected, not just in years, but in the particular way that financial anxiety ages a person, hollowing something out behind the eyes and tightening something around the jaw. When he saw me, his face moved through 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds. Relief, guilt, and the specific discomfort of a man who knows he is exactly where his choices have brought him. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "Julian," I replied. I looked around the room while the silence from that exchange settled. The house was immaculate, but it was the immaculate of effort rather than ease. Every surface had been cleared and arranged. There were fresh flowers on the console table. Candles lit in the dining room, the good china already set. Everything was in its place. But there were no toys on the floor, no small shoes by the door, no evidence anywhere in that carefully staged space that a 9-year-old boy lived there. Leah was not home. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and something I could only describe as controlled anxiety, that particular combination of a meal prepared to impress and people performing emotions they do not feel. The china was their best set, the kind kept for occasions that needed to look more important than they were. The silverware caught the candlelight. Everything was exactly right, in the way that things are exactly right when someone has worked very hard to make sure nothing appears wrong. We sat down. What followed was 40 minutes of the most precisely constructed flattery I have ever been subjected to. They asked about the Vanguard shoot. They asked about Sterling Botanical's revenue projections just out of curiosity. They asked about the West Coast expansion they had apparently read about in a trade publication. Sloane told me twice that she had always believed I had an entrepreneurial spirit. Julian nodded along with the focused sincerity of a man, trying to remember which version of himself he was supposed to be performing. I ate my food. I answered in full sentences when a full sentence was required and in single words when it was not. I asked for the salt once. I complimented the chicken, which was genuinely well-cooked and deserved the acknowledgement. I did not fill the silences. I let them sit there, heavy and accumulating, the way unpaid debts accumulate, quietly at first, then with considerable pressure. And then Sloane, who had never in her life been able to tolerate silence, finally broke. She was about to say something unforgivable. Subscribers never miss moments like this. And if you're not subscribing, at least tell me this in the comments. Have you ever sat across from someone this brazen and had to keep your face completely still? Because what came out of her mouth next required every piece of composure I had left. She leaned forward with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing this moment all day. "B," Sloane began, and already in just that one word I could hear the gears turning. "We've been thinking. Your expansion into the West Coast market is such an exciting move. Bold, visionary, and the infrastructure requirements for something that scale, the physical build-out of a new headquarters, the structural consultation, that's not something you want to hand to strangers. She paused, letting that word strangers do its work. Julian has such a precise eye for structural design. His portfolio speaks for itself. And it seems like such a waste, such a shame, really, for Sterling Botanicals to be paying outside firms when family could be handling that work. When the people who know you best, who care about your legacy most, could be right there alongside you. She sat back, folded her hands, and smiled the smile of a woman who believes she has just said something generous. I looked at Julian. He set his Scotch glass down, and the sound of it meeting the table was the sound of a man who has run out of ways to delay the thing he came here to say. "The truth is, Mom," he said, and his voice had shifted. The performance had dropped out of it, leaving something rower and less rehearsed underneath. "We've had some setbacks. The market has been brutal. 2 of our major developments didn't close the way we projected, and we're carrying losses that are significant." He exhaled. "If you could provide the initial capital for the new headquarters build-out, consider it a family investment, it would stabilize everything. We'd be a team, the way it should have been." The way it should have been. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I need you to understand what was not said at that table. In the entire course of that dinner, through the roasted chicken and the fine china and the 40 minutes of carefully assembled flattery, not one question had been asked about my health. Not one question about the friends I had made or lost in 6 years. Not one acknowledgement of the Christmas mornings I had spent alone, or the health scare I'd had in year 4 when I found a lump that turned out to be benign, but that I had driven myself to the doctor to check, because there was no one to drive me. Not one word about any of it. They had looked at me across that mahogany table the way people look at an ATM, with focus and with expectation, and with absolutely no curiosity about what the machine itself might be experiencing. I set my fork down. I picked up my napkin and pressed it to the corners of my mouth. And then I asked, in the quietest voice I had used all evening, "Where is Leo?" Something moved across Sloane's face. It was small and fast, and if I had not been watching for it, I might have missed it, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a micro-adjustment of the smile. "He's at a sleepover," she said. "We thought tonight should be about us, rebuilding the adult's relationship first, getting the foundation right before bringing the little ones back into it." I let that answer sit in the air between us for a moment. My grandson, the child I had not been permitted to see for 6 years, the stated reason I had been handed the address of this dinner in the first place, the "we'd love for you to see how much Leo has grown" from Sloane's text, was not here. He had been strategically removed from the evening so that his presence could not complicate a financial negotiation. "How convenient," I said. I reached into my handbag and placed a manila envelope on the mahogany table between us. The sound it made was almost nothing, just paper meeting wood. But the way Julian's eyes dropped to it, and the way Sloane's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward it before stopping, told me that they had been expecting something in an envelope. A check, perhaps, a letter of intent, some form of financial instrument that would confirm that the evening had gone according to their plan. Julian reached for it with a hand that was not entirely steady. Tell me in the comments right now, guilty or not guilty, because what that envelope contained was something neither of them had prepared for. And the moment Julian opened it, everything at that table changed. Julian opened it the way a man opens something he believes contains his salvation, quickly, with hands that wanted to appear steady and weren't quite managing it. He pulled out the document. I watched his eyes move across the first line, then stop. Then move back to the beginning and read it again, more slowly, the way you reread something when the words are clear but the meaning refuses to settle. He looked up at me. "Mom," his voice had gone very quiet. "What is this?" "Read the rest of it," I said. He kept reading. Sloane, who had been watching his face rather than the document, leaned over to read alongside him. I watched the progression cross both of their expressions, the initial confusion, the dawning comprehension, and then, in Sloane's case, something that moved rapidly from comprehension to calculation to a very specific kind of stillness that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at and exactly what it meant for them. What Julian held in his hands was not a check. It was not a letter of intent or a capital investment agreement or any of the things they had set that table and cooked that chicken and sent that text to obtain. It was the legal documentation for a blind trust, established 3 months prior, fully funded, irrevocable. $5 million in my grandson's name. I had structured it carefully over several conversations with my attorney in the months after Sterling Botanicals crossed its first significant revenue threshold. Not because I had known this dinner would happen, but because I had known that if it ever did, I wanted to be ready. I had put the money somewhere they could see it and not touch it. I had built Leo a future that his parents could not spend. I explained the terms the way my attorney had explained them to me, clearly, without rush, the way you explain something to people who need to understand it completely. The first disbursement would come when Leo turned 21. A second at 25, contingent on enrollment in or completion of a post-secondary program of his choosing. The remainder at 30, by which point, God willing, he would be a man capable of deciding what a legacy means and what to do with one. The trust was managed entirely by an independent third-party board, 3 professionals with no personal connection to anyone in that room. Neither Julian nor Sloane held any administrative role, any advisory capacity, or any access to the funds for any purpose, under any description. At any point before the designated disbursement dates. No management fees. No family expense accounts. No temporary borrowing provisions. No mechanism whatsoever by which a failing architectural firm could position itself as a beneficiary of its grandmother's work. Julian set the papers down on the table. He pressed his fingers flat against them the way a man presses his hands against a surface when he needs something solid to hold onto. "Mom," he said carefully, is there a provision here for?" "There is one more condition," I said, "the important one." I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. "If either of you initiates any legal challenge to this trust, or attempts to access these funds through litigation, petition, or any other mechanism, the entire $5 million is redirected, immediately and irrevocably, to the National Park Service." I paused. "And Leo receives nothing." The room was completely still. Sloane was the one who broke it. The cream dress, the fixed smile, the carefully assembled warmth of the woman who had greeted me at the door, all of it was gone. What replaced it was something unadorned and unmanaged, the face of a woman who has just realized that the move she thought she was making has already been made against her. "You came into our home," she said. Her voice was low and tight. "You sat at our table, you ate our food, and now you're dangling money in front of us that we can't use to save our livelihood, to save this family, and you're calling it a gift. You're mocking us." I stood up. I took my time with it, smoothed the front of my jacket, straightened my pearls, picked up my handbag from the back of the chair. Then I looked at Sloane directly, with the full and unhurried attention of a woman who has nothing left to prove to anyone in that room. "I'm not mocking you," I said. "I'm doing exactly what you taught me to do." I let that land. 6 years ago, you sat on a patio in front of your friends and your caterer and your laminated nutritional roadmap, and you told my son that I was toxic, that I didn't respect boundaries, that it was him or me. I picked up my handbag. "Tonight, I came to your table and I set a boundary. I decided what my resources will and will not be used for. I decided who has access to what I've built and who does not." I looked at her steadily. "I learned from the best." Sloane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Julian had not moved from his chair. He was still looking at the documents on the table, his hands still pressed flat against the pages, as though holding them down could change what was written on them. I walked toward the door. "Justice like this doesn't find you. You have to stay close. Subscribe. And if you won't subscribe, then answer this honestly in the comments. Was the trust fair? Or did she go too far? Because the story isn't over yet. And what Julian said at the front door is something I wasn't prepared for." I was almost at the front door when I heard him. Not Sloane. Sloane had stayed at the dining room table. I heard the sharp scrape of her chair, and then nothing, which told me she had thought better of following and made the calculation that Julian should be the one to try. She was right about that, at least. If anyone in that house had a chance of reaching me, it was not her. It was him. His footsteps behind me were nothing like the confident stride of the man who had stood in that living room with his Scotch glass and his desperate eyes. They were quieter than that. Slower. The footsteps of someone who is not sure they have the right to close the distance they are crossing. Mom. I stopped. My hand was not yet on the door handle. I was standing at the threshold, one foot on the hardwood of their foyer, the other a half step from the front mat, from the cool night air, from the driveway where my car sat waiting with the quiet patience of something that belonged entirely to me. I did not turn around. Mom, please. His voice had dropped to something I had not heard from him in a very long time, something unguarded, stripped of the performance that had coated everything else that evening. It was the voice of a boy who used to appear in the kitchen doorway at 11 o'clock at night because he couldn't sleep and didn't want to say so. We're losing the house. I stood very still. I thought about what it had cost him to say those words. Julian had inherited his father's pride along with his father's eyes, and pride of that particular variety does not surrender easily or without pain. He was not performing now. This was real. This was a man standing in his own foyer telling his mother the truth about how far things had fallen, and I understood that it had taken everything he had left to say it out loud. I felt the old pull, the one that had kept me waiting by the mailbox, sending cards into silence, watching a stranger's blog for glimpses of a face I was not permitted to see in person. The pull that is particular to mothers, that deep, almost gravitational instinct to turn around, to absorb the damage, to make it smaller so that your child does not have to feel its full weight. I let the pull move through me, and then I let it go. I turned around slowly. Julian was standing in the middle of the foyer, not close, not reaching for me, just standing there, looking like a man who has finally run out of strategies and is left with nothing but the truth of where he is. I looked at him for a long moment, at the amber eyes, at the face I had memorized before he was old enough to know what memorizing meant. Then I spoke. Julian, my voice was quiet and even and absolutely certain. You lost the house the moment you let your wife kick your mother out of it for a piece of fudge. He said nothing. You didn't want a mother then, I continued. You don't want one now, you want a financier. I held his gaze for one final second. And as a businesswoman, you are a very poor investment. I turned back to the door. I opened it. I walked through it. I did not look back. I pulled out of their driveway without looking in the rearview mirror. Not as a statement, not as a final act of defiance. I simply had no need to look back at what I was leaving. The front door was closed. The porch lights were on. The neighborhood was exactly as it had been when I arrived. Every lawn trimmed to the same obsessive length. Every house glowing with the same calculated warmth. The whole street engineered to project a permanence that nothing built on performance can actually sustain. I drove away from it, and I felt the distance accumulate between us like something I was setting down rather than leaving behind. The Connecticut countryside at night has a particular quality that I have always found settling. The way the tree lines close in on either side of the road, dark and unhurried, indifferent to everything that human beings construct and destroy and reconstruct in the lit spaces between them. The sky was clear. I drove with the windows down 2 inches, enough to let the night air move through the car, cool and specific, carrying the smell of soil and pine and the particular cleanness of a spring evening that hasn't been asked to be anything other than what it is. Somewhere on the highway, my shoulders came down. I hadn't realized how high I had been holding them. I thought about what I had seen at that table. Not with anger. Anger requires energy, and I had spent mine on something far more constructive. I thought about it with the clear, unhurried attention of a woman who has finally seen a thing exactly as it is rather than as she wished it were. They had not changed. The dynamic, the calculus, the fundamental arrangement of that marriage and everything it prioritized, none of it had moved an inch in 6 years. Sloane was still performing. Julian was still choosing the performance over the truth. The set had been redressed and the costumes updated, but the play was the same play. The difference was that I was no longer in the audience. hopping for a different ending. I was going home. Home to 3 acres of living, growing, breathing evidence that what someone discards is not the same as what is worthless. Home to a greenhouse that had been built by my hands and the hands of people who chose to show up every morning because the work meant something. Home to Devon, who would have left the lights on in the office because she always did. Home to a life that was, and I want to be precise about this word, mine. I thought about Leo. I thought about him the way I always think about him, with a love that has nowhere to put itself yet, that sits patiently in the chest waiting for its moment. He was 9 years old. He did not know his grandmother's name in any real sense. He knew a face from old photographs, perhaps. A story his parents had told him, or not told him, shaped to fit whatever version of events served them best. But one day he would be 21. And on that day, he would learn that someone had been thinking about his future since before he was old enough to understand what a future was. He would know his grandmother had existed. He would know she had left him something real. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. These hands, the ones that had pulled weeds from compacted soil in the early morning cold, that had steadied a saw against fresh lumber and built raised beds from scratch, that had written the first check to Devon and signed the Vanguard living release forms and placed a manila envelope on a mahogany table with the composure of a woman who had done her grieving years ago and was finished with it. The same hands that, 6 years ago, had gripped a steering wheel in a driveway and shaken. They were not shaking now. Before I go, I want to talk to you directly. Not as a narrator, not as a character in a story you've been watching unfold. As a woman who has lived every word of what I've just told you, and who believes, genuinely, without reservation, that the reason stories like this one need to be told is not for the drama of them. It is for the truth inside them. The parts that are recognizable. The parts that belong to you as much as they belong to me. So let me leave you with 3 things I know to be true. The first is this: when someone shows you that you are optional, believe them, then make yourself exceptional. Not to prove something to them. Not to earn your way back into a room that was never worthy of you. Do it because you are still here and still capable, and the only genuine tragedy would be to let someone else's smallness determine the size of your life. The second, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't spend 6 years composing the perfect argument for why I deserve to be loved by my own son. I grew. I put my hands in the dirt and I built something that outlasted their opinion of me. And I want you to understand this: growth is the loudest sound in the world to people who expected you to wither. You don't need to announce your comeback. You just need to make sure it's real. The third, and this one I mean with everything I have, I could not give Leo 6 years back. Those years are gone. I made my peace with that on the drive home, the same way I make my peace with every loss that cannot be undone, by deciding what I will do with what remains. I put $5 million in a place where it will find him when he is old enough to understand it. I gave him a future instead of an apology. That is what grandmothers do. We plant things we may never see bloom. We tend the ground for people who don't yet know they'll need it. That is legacy. That is what roots are for. This channel exists because stories like Beatrice's deserve to be heard, and because the lessons inside them are the kind that protect you before you ever need them. Stories like this one don't warn you twice. Subscribe, stay ready. And if you're leaving today without subscribing, I understand. But do me one favor, tell me in the comments what story would make you stay, because we have more, and they are every bit as real as this one. My name is Beatrice Sterling, and I am finally, beautifully, authentically home.